Edward, Eddie, what do you want to be called?
From you, Dr. Stetzer.
Dr. Stetzer.
Yeah, but Ed is what people normally call him.
Ed Stetzer, who just finished his talk, and I want to get into that in a little bit, but I thought, we're doing this conference this week. Thought I would get some of your impressions. You're doing all this polling, all this research.
Yeah.
What would you say, top 2 or 3 concerns that you have regarding the church?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges you got to see is the fact that the perception of the church is increasingly negative. And I think ultimately, and that's, it's always the case. We can say, well, there are bad churches. Well, but there's unchurched people increasingly see the church. 72% said, agreed somewhat or strongly of the unchurched, that the church is full of hypocrites, people who do one thing and say another. 48% were willing to say Christians get on my nerves. I mean, would 48% of Americans say Jews get on my nerves or Muslims get on my nerves? But the reputation of the church is so bad.
So that was the language, get on my nerves?
That was exactly, we asked the exact question is, do you agree, disagree? Christians get on my nerves. This is a poll we did. And 48% said, I think it's 48%, yeah, get on my nerves. So it's pretty big concern when people are so willing to say even something like that. So the reputation is bad. But here's the problem. I don't know if it's a problem, but here's the reality. Ephesians 3:10 says God has chosen the church to make known his manifold wisdom. So the church is the instrument, the vessel, the tool of God's message, the delivery system that he has chosen. And I think Satan's plan is to give the church such a bad reputation that people will look to spirituality, but anywhere but the church. And so I think that's a big issue.
I heard you say earlier that your concern was fundamentally ecclesiology and missiology. Define that for everybody, and then speak into that as maybe the answer to those concerns you found in the poll.
And I think when I say that, I say 2 of the big issues that evangelicals are going to struggle with. Now, there's denominations debating, sexuality, debating the authority of Scripture, but for those who kind of have a biblical, high view of Scripture, they tend to struggle in 2 areas: ecclesiology, and the question I ask is, what expression of a New Testament church would be most appropriate in this context? And we've, in the interviews today, we've done from Mark Dever to, Mark Batterson. Same city, very different expressions. But as Mark said, Dever said in his interview, there is a New Testament church. There are things that matter in the way that we do church. It's not just here's 50 people together, this is a church, or 5,000 people. There's a church. So what a church is and how it expresses itself is one. And then missiology is what forms and strategies do we use to most effectively expand the kingdom, the gospel, where we're sent. So do we do, if churches are doing bus ministry, that was big in the 70s. Part of the challenge is, if
we're actually going to do some
bus
ministry,
you're catching on that. Well, that could come back. But the challenges today is the 50s came back. Most evangelical churches are ready to go. Yeah. The reality is, though, is that we don't live there. And so we've got to proclaim the gospel here. Unchanged gospel, changing cultural context. And that's the question of missiology. How do we engage the culture while remaining? Here's the challenge. It's easy to engage culture and forget about the Bible. It's hard to engage culture and at the same time maintain biblical fidelity. So how do we get biblically faithful, culturally relevant, counterculture communities for the gospel and the kingdom? That ultimately is the missiology, ecclesiology question.
One of the interesting things about this conference is the wide divergence and spectrum within evangelicalism. What do you think is the key to you want to go the neo-seeker side out to maybe the more reformed side as the polls. What is the key to those groups working together more, learning from each other? Just speak into that. I mean, I'm sure conferences like this are maybe part of that answer. What would you say? How can the church connect and learn from each other?
I do think it's a fascinating conference. I mean, you got reformed, contemporary, and emerging to a sense. Not hardcore, but probably the right wing of the emerging church. You got all 3 of them represented here. And I do think we can learn a lot from each other. Right now, I think the Reformed people bring us a rich view of Scripture, strong understanding of the church. I would say that for many of my Reformed friends that there's a struggle in the area of evangelism. Now, right now, there's this rash of resources out from the Reformed tradition on evangelism. People writing books on it, et cetera, which, I mean, it's kind of like me writing books on weight loss. I mean, it's great to write it.
Although you've lost a lot of weight.
And I appreciate that.
Thank
you. Well, but the point is that I think that many of the Reformed Christians can learn from some here about how to engage culture evangelistically. I think many in the contemporary church expression here can learn about a more strongly biblically driven ministry. I'm I mean, I'm not a seeker guy. I'm a worship and word guy. Let's worship God, let's preach the word. And I think those things are biblically normative, and so we should see them in the churches. And so, I don't think my challenge with some of the contemporary church stuff is not that it's compromising the gospel. There's always the hate bloggers who living with their mother in the basement. Every contemporary church is compromising the gospel. But I do think we need to be careful that in the busyness of drama and themes and all this sort of stuff, that the gospel is not necessarily compromised, but it's crowded out. There are biblically commanded things that we need to do. And I think contemporary churches need to hear more about the public reading of Scripture, the preaching of the Word, worship in God in spirit and in truth. And so I think that's something they can take away. And so I think there's all different things. I think what we're doing right now, probably because of the internet, is we're having conversations with ourselves, not with each other. So all the Reform guys get together and they belong. We can name the names. And what's funny is, so few people here know who Dever is. Everybody in the Reform world knows who Dever is. So few people in the Reform world know who Perry Noble is. Everyone in the contemporary church world knows who Perry Noble is. I think we can learn some from both. Would I probably tweak some things that both of them say that I would say I'll probably do a little different? Yeah. But I think there's some learning that can take place in humility. Now, we may not come to the same conclusions, but we can listen to each other on the journey.
What do you think are some boundaries, some frame of references, what would facilitate that? Because, I mean, how does that get done?
No.
Is that a theological, that we agree on certain, we say Christology, ecclesiology, missiology, and we're going to talk, what do you think the answer is to make that connect?
I think we see some people trying that. I think we see Dever here today. You know where Keller is right now. Keller's at Saddleback. And I think what we're finding is I think most in the contemporary seeker movement of the 80s and the 90s kind of said, that was probably too much. Even those who would be seeker, and I'm a seeker guy, I don't want to speak too much in. I just find people lie a lot about seeker churches. I'm not a seeker guy, but I think I can say that most of the seeker churches I know are a lot less seeker than they used to be. I mean, Willow. I mean, gee whiz, And so I think ultimately that there is a sense that the conversation can help each other. And I'm not, the conversation, can sound so nebulous. I do think that there are boundaries and there are theological statements. I mean, there are people I won't go speak to or work with. I just turned down a group yesterday because they were too far out of orthodoxy for me. But, I'll go pretty much anywhere, let me preach the gospel, unless they're preaching a false gospel. Well, I think there's got to be boundaries that are there. And so for me, I'm encouraged. We need to be pulling each other away. I think, I'll make a quote. Dean Gilliland is a very famous missiologist. He says the challenge in engaging every culture is, on the one hand, what's called obscurantism. The gospel's obscured because we're so attached to our conventional ways of practicing and teaching the faith that we veil its truth and power for those who are trying to see it through very different eyes. I think a lot of traditional churches are stuck in obscurantism, the gospel being obscured because people are looking and saying, oh, the gospel's traditional this. On the other hand, he says, the other danger is syncretism. When you go so far into culture that you concoct a gospel which is not the gospel, and you get basically impacted by paganism. I think ultimately that we've got both going on in evangelicalism right now. Some are going too far into culture. Probably most evangelical churches are not engaging culture at all. And so you've got this pull back and forth. Here's the danger. Obscurantism, I know it's technical terms, but obscured. Obscurantism and syncretism when it's mixed. The problem is when you are more afraid of the one, you almost always fall into the other. Leslie Newbigin said that. So what happens is, you got all these people saying, we don't want to be syncretistic, so we won't get anything from the world. But what they do is they still get from the world, they just get from a 300-year-old world. Yeah. And it's holy if it's old. And so I think ultimately, it's got to be both, and we need to hear each other in that conversation. In my own denomination, we desperately need to hear each other in that conversation. The backlash against contextualization that's going on in evangelicalism right now is unhelpful. Evangelicals do not need now a theological excuse not to engage the culture. But at the same time, this willy-nilly rushing into culture and saying, we're going to tell, let's let the culture completely in the church and we'll reach people for Jesus because of it. I think that's naive.